Today, you're about to discover the plague that nearly destroyed the greatest empire in the world, the Plague of Justinian. He woke up without pain. The night before, he had gone to bed laughing with his children, telling them stories by the light of a single candle. The next morning, he couldn't get out of bed. There was no wound, no cut, no explanation. Only a dark swelling growing beneath his arm, as if something were being born inside him. His wife called his name. He didn't answer. She called again. Only then did she notice the fever burning through his skin and the swelling that seemed to pulse on its own. Within hours, he was dead. And the most terrifying part wasn't the disease itself. It was that no one knew what was killing an entire empire. To understand the depth of that darkness, you first have to understand the brilliance that came before it. In the 6th century, Constantinople was no ordinary city. It was the center of the known world, the capital of an empire ruled by a man who dreamed of restoring the lost glory of Rome, Emperor Justinian. Under his rule, armies marched to reclaim distant territories. Magnificent cathedrals rose from the ground, and one of them, with a dome so immense it seemed to float effortlessly in the sky, would become the symbol of a people who believed they stood closer to God than any generation before them. In the streets, Greek, Egyptian, Syrian, and Persian merchants crossed paths through the narrow alleyways near the harbor. Ships arrived loaded with silk, ivory, wine, and above all, grain. The wheat of Egypt fed the very heart of the empire. Ships sailed up the Nile, crossed the Mediterranean, passed through the Bosporus, and sustained a city of hundreds of thousands of people packed behind magnificent walls. It was a perfect system. Fast, efficient, interconnected. An empire that finally believed itself to be invincible. But every perfect system hides a weakness within its own perfection. And this one's weakness was simple. Everything that nourished the empire could also, without warning, carry the seed of its destruction. Inside the crowded granaries of Egypt, rats lived among towering sacks of grain waiting to be loaded onto ships. Clinging to them were fleas. And inside those fleas lived an ancient, silent bacterium that had lain dormant for centuries in some distant corner of the world. It was in no hurry. It simply waited. When the right conditions emerged, famine, overcrowding, and the constant movement of people and ships, the leap happened. From rat to flea. From flea to human. And from one human being to an entire empire. The first signs appeared at a distant port. High fever, delirium, and dark, painful swellings emerging from the body. The people there had no idea they were witnessing the beginning of a tragedy that would change the course of world history. And in Constantinople, no one imagined it would ever reach the capital. At first, it was nothing more than a rumor. One merchant heard from another that in distant lands, entire cities were being emptied. People listened with a mixture of sympathy and detachment. Things like that happened far away, in other places, to other people. Then, on an ordinary day, a fisherman never cast his nets. The next day, a baker near the harbor never opened his shop. By the following week, an entire neighborhood near the docks seemed quieter than usual. Then, everything erupted at once. People walked down the street as they always had, and collapsed dead before reaching the end of the block. Entire families who went to bed healthy never woke up again. A palace official named Procopius witnessed the horror firsthand and tried, in his own words, to capture something that seemed greater than human language itself could describe. Bodies abandoned in the streets, houses locked from the inside with entire families lying dead behind their barred doors, a stench that no one could ignore anymore. The physicians of the time, the finest the empire had to offer, were completely helpless. They had no concept of invisible contagion. They believed the air itself had been corrupted, that the stars had aligned against mankind, and that some collective sin demanded punishment. They bled patients who were already too weak to survive another loss. They lanced the victims' swollen buboes, unaware that they were only spreading the infection further, with the very hands trying to heal them. Every attempt at a cure only fueled the disease itself. There was no right choice, only choices that killed more slowly or more quickly. Justinian himself was struck by the plague. For days, the fate of the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean rested on the breathing of a single feverish man lying in bed, while his wife alone carried the burden of keeping an entire government standing. He survived. Hundreds of thousands around him did not. And here lies the cruelest irony of the entire story. The very greatness he had built, the crowded city, the bustling harbor, the vast trade network linking entire empires, was exactly what made Constantinople the perfect place for catastrophe to erupt beyond all control. The same system that had brought prosperity was now delivering death at the same speed, along the very same routes. The gravediggers worked until they could no longer stand. Then they stopped altogether, because they too were dead. With no room left in the cemeteries, enormous mass graves were dug on the outskirts of the city. Bodies were stacked layer upon layer, covered with only a thin blanket of earth before making room for the next wave. When even that was no longer enough, abandoned towers were turned into vertical burial pits. The bells that had once announced celebrations and prayers now rang without end, marking funeral after funeral, until people stopped reacting to the sound. The bells had lost their meaning. They became nothing more than background noise, as constant as the wind. Then came the worst silence of all, the silence of streets that had once overflowed with life, the silence of shuttered marketplaces, the silence of ships sitting motionless in the harbor with no crews left to sail them. The collapse was not only of bodies, it was the collapse of society itself. Parents stopped caring for their own sick children, terrified of catching the disease. Neighbors stopped knocking on each other's doors. Servants abandoned their masters. Masters abandoned their servants. The disease did not discriminate by wealth or status, and that, in a way, made it even more terrifying. There was no protection that money could buy. Fear transformed solidarity into isolated survival. Crowds gathered inside packed churches, praying for forgiveness that might bring the plague to an end. But those same crowds, packed tightly together and breathing the same stale air, unknowingly helped the disease spread even faster. The faith that was meant to save them was also killing them. Following the very trade routes that had once made Justinian's empire flourish, the plague spread to Syria, Italy, and Gaul, eventually reaching even the British Isles. Entire villages vanished from the historical record, erased without leaving behind a single name or memory. Wheat fields, the very ones that had fueled the empire's prosperity, rotted where they stood, with no one left to harvest them. And little by little, like a wildfire that consumes everything in its path, the plague began to lose momentum. Not because it had been defeated, but because there were simply no more people left to infect. The exact number of deaths will never be known, but historians estimate that tens of millions died across the Mediterranean, wiping out nearly half the population in some regions. Justinian's dream of rebuilding Rome did not collapse in a single battle, but in the silent absence of millions of lives that would never exist again. And perhaps the most disturbing part of this story is that centuries later, scientists examined bones and historical records from that era using modern technology and uncovered something chilling. The bacterium that devastated Justinian's empire was the very same species that 800 years later would sweep across the world again under another name, bringing another catastrophe in another age. The same invisible enemy.
Dormant for centuries, waiting only for the right conditions to spread again. Empty streets, doors shut out of fear of one another. Authorities struggling to contain something they cannot even see. Does this sound like a story from 1500 years ago? Or does it feel unsettlingly familiar? Perhaps the greatest lesson this story leaves us is not about bacteria, rats, or ships. Perhaps it is about how every civilization, no matter how magnificent it appears, carries within itself its own fragility, hidden beneath routine, trade, and the quiet confidence that tomorrow will be just like today. And maybe that is why these stories keep returning. Because the past is not just memory. Sometimes it is a warning. I'll see you in the next era.